Ladies and gentlemen, the 2023 Italian Grand Prix is over, and we got a race that had very high highs, but also some pretty boring lows as well. We're going to go through every single aspect of it here in our race recap. We're going to go over my quick hits, our weekend winners and losers, and as well go over the predictions I made before the race weekend began. But as always, if you're a Formula One fan, go ahead, hit that subscribe button down below. We're growing this little community. I'm a very new American to F1, so I'm having a lot of fun covering it for you here on YouTube. But let's go ahead, let's start off right now with our race quick hits. It was a very exciting Italian Grand Prix this year, although it did end up being a Red Bull 1-2, and Max does officially set the record for most consecutive race wins in Formula One history at 10, surpassing Sebastian Vettel's 9 race wins back in his tenure at Red Bull. It was an amazing race by Max. Obviously, in that car, it's definitely not too long a stretch to see him continuing his streak, and honestly at this point it's hard to see him not continuing to build this streak and potentially even winning every single race weekend left on the calendar, a feat not many of us would ever have imagined in Formula One, but we're kind of seeing it, kind of happen before our very eyes. So a Red Bull 1-2 in Monza. I'm sure the Tifosi were excited nonetheless, and all of us actually didn't mind it too much. At least I know I didn't, because we actually got some running towards the front, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But a Red Bull 1-2, and there's not really a whole lot more to say than that. Moving on to something that the Italians might actually really enjoy talking about is a Ferrari 3-4, which might actually just be as good as a 1-2 when you're talking about taking Red Bull out of the equation. It was a very, very well-run race by the Scuderia Ferrari drivers. Like I said, ended up coming home 3-4 in a weekend that they absolutely seemed to nail it. There was some questionable decisions made about when to pit, when not to pit. By the time the drivers actually did end up boxing, their tires were absolutely destroyed. And even at the end of the race, their tires were also very, 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 very used. And so it was a little touch and go here or there, but they end up coming home 3-4, picking up a good chunk of points on their bid for finishing P2 in the constructors title. And it was not without some shocking and potentially scary moments for Ferrari fans, as down the stretch of this race, maybe the last 5 to 7 laps, we got to see both Ferrari drivers absolutely going at each other's throats. Charles Leclerc was adamant to trying to take that podium spot away from Carlos, and Carlos was doing his best to defend that podium, which I think he rightfully earned, performing very, very well across the entire weekend. And there was even a moment on the last lap where Charles Leclerc sends the dive bomb of all dive bombs down into turn 1, and as we all know, turn 1 in Monza is the absolute best place to full send a dive bomb. And thankfully for them, we did not have a Red Bull 2018 Baku moment, which would have absolutely shattered the hearts of the Tifosi, and they end up coming home 3-4 in a very, very well run race by then. Mercedes had a very naughty day, both drivers picking up 5-second penalties over the course of the 51 laps. And ultimately, it ended up not mattering, as Lewis, finishing in 6th, had enough time behind to the group behind to where it ended up not mattering. And George had, I believe, about a 20-second gap behind to Lewis, being in 5th, that his 5-second penalty didn't end up mattering either. George got a penalty from basically skipping the turn 1 chicane and overtaking Ocon, and received a 5-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining advantage. And then Lewis ended up getting a penalty for kind of coming together with Oscar Piastri and giving Oscar damage and causing a collision. Ultimately, like I said, it ended up not mattering, as they had built the gap by the time the race ended, but it did kind of ruin Piastri's race, and so it was kind of tough for him. But at the same time, Lewis got his penalty, and it was what it was. But a very, very solid day for Mercedes, who had a very tough qualifying on Saturday, but came through to finish 5th and 6th on track in this one. Moving down the order a little bit, we got Alex Albon had a very, very good race, finishing in the points once again. Williams very quickly moving up the order in the constructors, closing in on that midfield. Very exciting to watch, if I do say so myself. And personally, I think it's time to start talking about Alex Albon being a potential top 5 driver this year, especially if he can keep up his recent form. The Williams, I think, is not necessarily the punching bag that it has been in recent years. And while it is hard to say exactly how good that car is, considering Logan Sargent is still, having his rookie moments, including also getting a penalty in this weekend as well. But Alex Albon is absolutely deserving of every bit of praise here recently, and he has performed adamantly and admirably, rather, as the season has continued on. Shout out Liam Lawson for finishing P11. Seems like his potential that we've heard so much about may actually live up to the hype. He's performed very, very well. And considering Yuki Tsunoda had the unfortunate privilege of not starting in this one as his engine blew up on the formation lap, he was the only AlphaTauri running in this one, and bringing it home in P11 is a very, very impressive thing, especially in an AlphaTauri that has not looked particularly great at times this year. And doing it at Monza, while it might help to be in sort of these DRS trains, finishing P11 is no small feat. And then the last quick hit that I have is kind of just like what I mentioned earlier. We had an actual battle for the lead, with Carlos Sainz taking pole position in this one and actually leading for about 15 and a half laps out of 51 total laps. And it was very, very exciting to see his defense of Max Verstappen. And we actually got to see a top 3 or 4 drivers competing for those front running places. And it was very exciting not to see, Max just pass Carlos and just run off into the distance as he has been wont to do so far this year. Thankfully, the Monza setup requirements for these cars has meant that the DRS was actually much less effective than it normally would have. And so we actually got to see a very, very exciting beginning part of this race before Max did ultimately take the lead when the Ferrari's tires did finally kind of drop off a cliff. But at the same time, we got to see an actual battle for the lead. And even down the stretch, we got to see a battle for the podium as well, which we are not going to complain about at all. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move on to our weekend winners and losers. All right, moving on to our weekend winners and losers. We've already touched on both of my selections, but if you're new here, our weekend winners or losers could be a team, it could be a driver, it could be literally anything, but we have gone for a mixture this week. My weekend winner, will start there, is Carlos Sainz. I think it makes the most sense. He ends up taking pole position on an absolutely beautiful lap there at the death in Q3 to give the Ferrari fans something to cheer about going into Sunday. And he did end up leading the race for about 15 laps or so before Max was able to finally get by and rain off into the distance. But Carlos looked like the much more consistent and much quicker driver this weekend. If you remember my predictions, I predicted Charles basically to have the weekend that Carlos did end up having. And so ultimately, I mean, it's definitely easy to say that Carlos was definitely the biggest winner here. He had a fantastic weekend, and all in all, good job, Carlos. You're my weekend winner. And then moving on to our weekend losers, we have gone for a team in this one. I actually went back and forth about which team I was going to pick, but ultimately I went with Alpine. They have definitely been off the pace all weekend long, and really it showed in the race as well as in qualifying. Both drivers were out in Q1 in qualifying, and actually only one finished the race at all, as Esteban Ocon ended up retiring from the race for a reason I never actually really saw. He kind of just silently bowed out of the broadcast and out of the race, and Pierre ends up finishing P15. In a week where a lot of talk has been about this agreement for the 2026 engine regulations to kind of homologate those and kind of make them as similar as possible, you can definitely see why Renault is pushing for this very, very strongly, as that Renault engine put them behind the 8 ball at the start of the weekend, and really it never got better. And so Alpine, I know you're fighting in the midfield, but you were right at the back in this one, so I'm sorry, but you're my weekend loser. And finally, we've come to going over my predictions results. We make our predictions every week before the race weekend. And this week, spoiler alert, went absolutely horribly. It was a tough weekend for me in terms of predictions, but we're going to go over them right now. We'll start with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went for Charles Leclerc, like I mentioned earlier. And while I would love to say Charles had a very, very good weekend, it's hard not to look literally on the other side of the garage and find someone who did a lot better. Carlos definitely ended up being, I think, the biggest positive surprise of the race weekend. He was very consistently fast. He was consistent in the race. He was consistent in qualifying, and ultimately ended up on the podium. And yes, Charles had a very clean race, ended up P4, but I can't say it was the biggest positive surprise because Carlos knocked it out of the park. So unfortunately, I'm starting off my predictions 0 for 1 on this one. As we move into my biggest disappointment, which I'll also go ahead and just say 0 for 1 because I picked Sergio Perez. Checo has just had a wild season this year, and I honestly thought I was onto something when he ended up spinning off in the practice sessions, causing a red flag, and it gave me a lot of, not necessarily hope, I don't hope that Checo has issues, but when I made my choice for biggest disappointment, it kind of gave that little inkling in the back of my head that I may have picked right. But ultimately, he ends up second just behind Max, which at this point of the season is kind of the best you can hope for with him making his way forward through the field. So unfortunately, I'm 0 for 1 in that one as well, and 0 for 2 overall, as we'll now move into my qualifying results, my qualifying top 3 for the Italian Grand Prix. And this one was a little more all over the place after looking at the official results, as we had Max Verstappen. I predicted a Max Verstappen pole, a Charles Leclerc P2, and a Lando Norris P3. And that definitely did not come true. 0 for 3 on that one. Max actually ends up not taking pole thanks to Carlos Sainz. So I am 0 for so far. As we now move into my podium predictions, where I predicted a Max Verstappen win, finally on the board, that's 1 point. A Lando Norris P2 did not happen. Lando did finish in the points, but unfortunately well off the podium in this one. And then a P3 result for Charles Leclerc. And while it was very close, it definitely did not happen, as ultimately Carlos held off his teammate to finish on the podium himself. So 1 for 3 on race results, and the only thing that's going to save us is my Haas predictions for the race weekend. I predicted one car into Q2. We managed to nail that thanks to some tough pace from the Alpines, as Nico Hülkenberg makes it into Q2 before qualifying P13. And I predicted a close to a points finish. Unfortunately, this didn't end up happening, as both cars finished 17th and 18th, I believe, which is the last 2 positions for the cars that actually finished the race. So I think that's about as far from a points finish as you can get. So 1 of 2 on my Haas prediction. I went conservative, and I still only got 50%. But if you've been keeping track, that was 10 total possible points to get, and I got 2. I got 2 points out of 10. This was a tough one. Thankfully, I'll have a week off before we head to Singapore to rethink my strategy and kind of mull over who and what teams are going to be doing well around the next circuit. So keep an eye out for those predictions. It'll be coming the week of the race. But that is my predictions recap. I did not do very well. Hopefully we can bounce back going into the next Grand Prix weekend. There it is, guys. The 2023 Italian Grand Prix is over. But what did you think of the race? Let me know down in the comments below. And did you make any predictions? And what did you make of them? Let me know in the comments below as well. Go ahead, hit subscribe. We'll be back again with more F1 23 and F1 Manager 23 videos before we head to Singapore and cover the next race weekend. But I hope you enjoyed Monza. It's always one of my personal favorites since I started following Formula 1 last year. I've gone back and watched highlights from I don't know how many races. It's just so exciting to see all of those cars hurtling down towards turn 1. It's one of my favorites, and it's going to be one of my favorites for years to come. But that'll wrap it up here for me in this one, guys. Thank you so much for making it this far into the video. And until the next one, I'll see you guys in the next one.